What do young people get completely wrong about past decades? Story 1. They understood restaurants had smoking sections and that bars and clubs were filled with cigarette smoke, but I don't think many understood how pervasive smoking was. There were ashtrays and people smoking literally everywhere. Jury boxes had ashtrays in front of every juror. The judge smoked, the lawyers smoked, the gallery smoked. You smoked on planes, trains, buses, taxi cabs, and all transportation centers. You smoked at the library, the PTO meetings at school, the town hall, and all city offices. Hell, you could smoke in the courtyard at my high school as a student. You smoked in the elevator and on the escalator. The mall, sports venues, doctor's offices, hospitals, the movies, the plays, opera, concerts, and every other public performance. A non-smoker would come home often smelling like smoke. One was constantly surrounded by smoke. It was insane. I remember this in the 90s growing up. My aunt was a waitress and we'd go in and see her/eat at her restaurant all the time. We'd sit in the no smoking section, but it'd really just be a few specific tables that didn't have ashtrays in one big open room that was absolutely filled with smoke. This was just like a normal family restaurant, not a dive bar or club or something, and clearly no one thought much about it. That was a childhood memory I hadn't thought about in a while. You're 9 years old. You pull up on a bicycle to your friend's house on Saturday morning. You go inside and his mom's writing him a note and gives him $1. The note says he has permission to buy his mother a pack of cigarettes. You and your buddy ride down to the convenience store. You hand the note to the owner along with the money and he hands you a pack of cigarettes and the change and off you go. Sunday morning, your family goes to Denny's. Inside the lobby, in the waiting area, there's a vending machine at eye level with an elementary age kid, which only dispenses packs of cigarettes. They take quarters and no one gives a second thought to anyone who happens to put 4 quarters into the machine, pulls the knob and walks off with a pack of Lucky Strikes. Everywhere has ashtrays. McDonald's, the passenger airplane seats, the desks in the community college classroom, the table under the umbrella outside the teacher's lounge at the high school, and every car you buy comes with ashtrays in the doors or seats, and cigarette lighters in the console. Crazy how a lot of this stuff still exists. Story 2. Probably underestimating how few choices there were. Today it seems like everything imaginable is available in a variety of sizes delivered to your door overnight. Catalogs and mail orders with 4 to 6 weeks delivery, malls were the best thing ever. All the stores are in one place and not downtown. Definitely, and also just how little people knew they were missing out. If it wasn't on network evening television, channels 2, 4, 7, 9, and 11, or on a store shelf in your town, or in the Sunday newspaper, it simply didn't exist for you. If you had an inkling something existed, say tinfoil that comes in sheets instead of one giant roll, you could go around asking people if you wanted, but you were more than likely to just get a shrug and that's it. Why would you want such a thing? Let's say you were particularly enterprising, so you dial 0 and ask the operator for the number for the corporate headquarters of Reynolds, if you knew the city it was in, because there was no internet and the only way to find a number was by dialing 0 and speaking to a telephone operator. But even if you spoke to someone at Reynolds, they had no way to exchange money for goods at that level, and they probably would just tell you that they sell it in the Ohio area, and that would be that. You went to the market. They have one brand of pancake mix, and no one had ever heard of anything different. Why would you want a different brand anyway? Then you go to the hardware store, and they carry 2 brands of paint, and no one had ever heard of any other brand of paint. And it was that way for a long, long time. Life definitely seemed more simple back then. Fewer choices meant less decision fatigue. Need pancake mix? Well, there's only that one brand, take that and go. Paint? 2 brands? Pick one of those and go. Now there are millions of brands and millions of choices to make each and every single day. It's nice, but it's tiring having to do all the research to pick the best one that suits your needs. Then if it's not the right one, you ship it back and restart the search again. We have everything but own nothing. We have subscriptions for anything and everything. Just a few days ago, I saw a post on Reddit about a printer having a subscription service, something like 10 pages a month or some absurd amount of money. It was ridiculous. Millions of choices, most of them poor quality and liable to fall apart. Story 3. I am definitely an older person, born in 1949. What today's young people don't appreciate is how growing up we had to invent our own sources of fun. There were no video games, which I enjoy playing, just 3 channels on our black and white TV. We didn't get color until 1967, and no real entertainment aimed at kids. All we could do was interact with each other and play established games like marbles or maybe an organized sport like Little League Baseball. There was a baseball diamond, overgrown with weeds, across the street from us, but mostly we played in the woods that surrounded us, climbing trees, pretending to be pirates or some such. I loved the bookmobiles that would visit my street, and I must have read every biography, all bound in blue covers, in my elementary school library. It was a different era with many fewer distractions and much more time for sustained imagination. Being a different time, we developed different skills for interacting with the world and each other than young people do today. Was it better? That's hard to say. We tend to have an insular view of our own little world, while today it is hard to escape what is happening everywhere on Earth. We had to wait days for a letter to arrive, and we shared a party line with our neighbor's phone. That is a far slower pace than today's instantaneous texting culture. Yes, I do text. Some things have been lost while others have been gained. That's the way it will always be. Just wait. This was true even in the 90s in some parts of the world. I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, Sri Lanka, and I distinctly remember how hard entertainment was to come by. We had no mobiles or even PCs. Not much gaming. There were like 4 national TV channels for the entire country which started broadcasting at like 4 p.m. on weekdays. Certainly nothing like streaming. Sure, we could rent VHS, but those cost money. Things like concerts were mostly seasonal. We had to make up our own entertainment, and playing outside was a huge part of it. I'm part of the last generation that grew up that way. My childhood was analog. My adulthood was digital. Yes, I had Nintendo, but I had only like 3 or 4 games, and you can only play Mario Brothers so many times. I knew every kid in my neighborhood and most of the kids within a few miles of me. I did the same crap, played in the woods away from parents' eyes. Sometimes I wonder how we all survived falling out of trees and thinking BB guns were just fine to play a massive game of war with. We all did, however. Maybe we have a few more scars than younger generations do. Maybe we don't. I don't know. I know I have more than my kids, though. The iPad generation is gonna rule us one day, and I'm not really prepared for it. Story 4. Probably just how often you had to accept that you couldn't find out the answer to something. If you had a question, you could ask your family, maybe your friends, maybe your teachers, and your last chance was to check the library. But if the library didn't have the answer, then you just had to accept that you weren't going to get an answer, or you'd have to hope to come across that answer someday in the future. Now you just ask Google and get 10 answers in just seconds. I was born in the 90s, and I still occasionally miss being a kid or early teen and having discussions with your friends where you're both sure you're right about something, but would just have to agree to disagree about it and move on. Now, somebody always has to pull their smartphone out and clarify. I guess theoretically it should lead to less ignorant populations, but because the information is so readily available at your fingertips, it's like no one really knows anything, and instead relies on their phone to be their memory or intelligence. Yeah, I was explaining this to my son and he just didn't get it until I said, imagine you have to research something for homework. You'd have to take a trip to the library, look up the books you need, or try to find the relevant books if you didn't already have a list. If someone else hadn't already checked them out, you can check them out and then go home and research from a book that was probably written 5 years previously. The ability to instantaneously research something is one of the best things about the modern day. Story 5. How common drinking and driving was. Until MAD came along, people did this routinely. It's where One for the Road originated. Yes, when my friends and I had our 18th birthday in late 1979, the thing to do was to celebrate by driving through the beer barn, where you could literally drive through to get beer, wine coolers, whatever, then open them up and drive while drinking. At 18, this was in Texas. It also was not uncommon for my dad to drive while drinking when he was taking us wherever at night. Zero education on why you should not do that. Drinking and driving is still super common. When I was in high school, 2008 to 2012, almost everyone in my school used to booze cruise, meaning we'd drink in a car and drive around New York City. I have siblings who say this is still really popular. Kids even post it on YouTube. Of course, they won't show the liquor, but they post videos of them swimming through traffic. Story from my dad. I was a kid, medium-sized town in Queensland, Australia, in the very early 90s. After work, all the lads would hit the pub for a few beers, etc., etc. After a couple of hours, the local police sergeant would turn up and order a pint. This was most people's cue for last drinks and drive home. Once he'd slowly finished his pint, well then he was on the beat. So if you acted up or weaved around on the road, he might pull you over. They knew each other by name, and the drunk lads would have a chat with the sergeant at times. The occasional stayed too long, got too drunk started being a danger, resulting in arrest never seemed to dent the friendship either. Story 6. A lot of people sound like they think we lived in silent bubbles because we didn't have smartphones and computers weren't common. On the contrary, we talked a lot. Like, a lot. If you had questions, you talked. Then you went to the library, and then you talked some more, and wrote letters and passed notes like crazy. The chatter never fucking stopped. People would scold women for gossiping and made jokes about it, but the men were just the same. Everyone is like, kids these days have no privacy, but you couldn't kiss your boyfriend on the street without hearing about it from every fucking rando in the neighborhood. Entertainment budgets were also a lot lower. People passed the time by doing something like listening to the radio with friends. That was an activity. A million streaming services and replacing multiple fancy devices every few years wasn't really a thing because the money got blown on essentials. And those essentials, while quality, weren't cheap, and not many jobs paid well. You could afford an apartment, but you wouldn't be doing much else at all but conversing with friends in person. And while we didn't have smartphones, we had regular phones, which were always being used for local calls. Long-distance calls were for the weekends. Remember the stereotype for the 80s and 90s, teenage girls spending their evenings being glued to the phone talking to their friends, always on the phone, spending hours talking about anything and everything. Also the 50s, 60s, and 70s girls. Guys did it too, especially with their girlfriends. And now my college students are afraid to talk on the phone. It gives them anxiety, even when they know the person on the other end. They also think it's rude to make phone calls to other people. Very different set of ideas these days. I never got call anxiety growing up, but I definitely do now. Different times. Story 7. Maybe not everyone's experience, but for me, there was casual violence everywhere. Smacking kids was not only tolerated, but expected. Hit by parents, friends' parents, random adults in the neighborhood, teachers, etc. Then you'd get beat for making the teacher hit you. What will the neighbors think? Was real. When I was growing up, I had friends whose parents beat them almost bloody, to the point where they couldn't come to school for the next couple of days. I fucking hated elementary school teachers who'd call their parents for bullshit stuff, and thought they were being dramatic when they'd beg and plead to not call their parents. Honestly, I think some knew and liked my friends begging them. I had to cut my own switch and grew up in the suburbs. Cut a neighbor's weeping willow branch once without realizing it was basically a whip. We had to bend over the bed bare-assed and couldn't move. After about 2 swats, I jumped up because the pain was too much, and my dad just started swinging and caught me across the face twice. Serious marks. I couldn't go to school that week because my parents were afraid they'd get in trouble. Oddly, that did not stop the beatings. Mom would just slap me out of nowhere if I did something dumb. Dad would pull my pants down and slap the shit out of my ass or rough me up if I didn't do what he wanted right away. It was normal. Eventually, I got big enough that my dad couldn't do it anymore because I'd fight back. I don't even think he was being malicious. I think that's what he thought was the right thing. Story 8. People say that the 80s were all about consumerism, which is true, but the products were well made and fixable. Towns had repair shops for everything. You just didn't buy a disposable TV. If it broke, you took it in to get fixed. Nowadays, if your TV breaks, it's tossed and you get a new one. Yes, I remember cracking the screen of my phone pretty badly. This was when I had just gotten an iPhone. I went by Apple so they could fix it. They just said they were going to replace it. Everything from laptops to phones just gets replaced. No one fixes anything anymore. Same with clothes or shoes, except for the expensive clothing and shoes, but with fast fashion, if something is ripped, it's replaceable. Speaking of the 80s, we didn't just wear bright neon colors all the time. That's definitely a cognitive dissonance thing. It was an MTV thing, not a real life thing. Watch any movie actually filmed in the 80s and set in the 80s. The Breakfast Club, Working Girl, Big, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Say Anything, The Goonies, Fast Times, etc. You will notice a very glaring lack of neon, crazy hairstyles, leotards, and all the other trapping that are associated with 80s fashion. Some things are absolutely a trend of their time, but for the most part, everybody dressed just like they do now. Same thing with the 90s. Right, the vast majority of people were not dressing like Madonna or Cyndi Lauper. Story 9. that it was incredibly common to just not have pictures of events or other things we see as important now. Not only did we have entire vacations where no pictures were taken, but we could go months without a single picture being taken of any member of our family unless it was particularly notable. A trip to St. Louis? No pictures. A trip to Disneyland? Maybe a picture at the entry gate or one of the souvenir pictures of us with a character. A trip to the zoo? No pictures. An average day? Forget about it. Frequently, the only pictures taken were on major holidays like Christmas or on someone's birthday. I think about this often. Also, the fact that our photos were all printed could, I think, make the years between about 1930 and 1995 the most remembered in the distant future. I feel like digital images will be so plentiful that they'll go away when someone dies. What would you do with a relative's photo drive? If they take pictures at the rate most people do, it's unlikely you're going to spend weeks combing through terabytes of files. My grandparents left about 6 photo albums. When my grandpa passed, we all spent the afternoon passing them around, reminiscing, and pulling out a few photos we each wanted to keep. That's going to be lost on future generations. I see you never met my grandmother. That woman took more pictures than anyone ever. She took pictures of us standing in front of our school, or for my parents. They were standing in front of their jobs. We were a military family, so there were a lot of different schools and jobs along the way. She would literally take a picture as she opened the door. There is a movie with Burt Reynolds and Goldie Hawn, and his mom does this. It's nuts. My grandmother wrote names, dates, and locations on the back of every one, too. Pictures of you standing with your new car, your new house, your new apartment, your new college, the restaurant we all went to dinner at when she came to visit, everything. I think this differs from family to family. My family has way too many pictures from the 80s. Story 10. How on time you had to be for your favorite shows because there was little to no chance that you'd see that same episode again until they hopefully did reruns during the summer. I remember waiting anxiously for the nightly news to be over so I could watch my favorite TV shows. Commercial breaks were just mad rushes for the bathroom or to the kitchen to get something quick to drink. I feel I was in the last generation of this, even though channels were much more prevalent and reruns of everything were the norm. I remember rushing off the bus with all my friends because we were absolutely sure Goku was going to defeat Frieza in this episode, and it was a crapshoot whether or not the driver would be fast enough for us to make it. Years later, when DVDs started becoming more prevalent, they still didn't put shows on collectible media regularly. You couldn't just get an entire season of a show and binge it. At most, you could find a best-of compilation of 5 or 6 of the most popular episodes, and that was only if the show was incredibly popular, and what I am describing here was considered having it good compared to older people. It was right around 2000 that everything changed with TiVo, DVR, and on demand. Sure, you could set your VCR, but that worked like 80% of the time and you often missed the first or last couple of minutes. I was in college in 1999 and my girlfriend and her friends would all watch Dawson's Creek at 9 o'clock, and I openly admit I liked the show, but I had a night class about 50 minutes away that got out at 8, and it was really tight getting from the classroom to her TV for 9. I got pulled over for speeding and the cop asked me why I was going so fast, and I told him Dawson's Creek starts at 9 and I'm still 20 minutes away. He was not amused. I have young kids and was running some in my day stuff past them to see what piqued their interest. I thought that mobile phones and digital cameras would be things that they could imagine living without, but what really blew their mind was the idea of broadcast media. We don't have a TV at home, so they've never experienced video that isn't on demand, or even that can't be paused. I'm not sure they really believed me when I described the idea of missing a show or needing to wait a week for the next episode. Local news playing over regular TV was one of the most annoying things ever. Story 11. My grandmother smoked basically every second that she was awake from the age of 13 through 75. She loved it and said she would rather die than stop. She smoked in her house and her car, even in bed. I used to stay with her a lot. I went to a strict private school for high school. They were on campus, off campus, which meant you had to conduct yourself in the same way at home as at school. My parents went out of town for 2 weeks. I had to stay with my grandparents. I was about 15 and knew I smelled like an an ashtray. What could I do? I had to stay with her. Even my hair smelled like it, so I'm at school and I get called out of class and sent to the principal. He explained to me that several teachers had complained that I smelled like smoke, and he knew I had been smoking before I came to school. I told them I was staying at my grandparents' and my grandmother smoked non-stop, and that's why. They said that was not true because my hair smelled like smoke and that only happens if you smoke. So they're about to suspend me. They call my parents. My parents had to tell them I was staying with my grandparents, and that's why. I was so embarrassed and self-conscious until my parents got back and I got to go home. Also, when we moved my grandparents to another house, we took down everything from the wall. Realized the walls were yellow from smoke. Where something had hung, the walls behind it were bright white. I often wondered what my grandmother's lungs looked like after this. My grandmother was the same, 2 to 3 packs per day minimum. She could stop. She needed several surgeries over the years, and her doctors refused to operate if she was actively smoking. So she would quit, get the care that she needed, and then start smoking again the day her sutures were removed or was given the release to. I was given my great-grandmother's fine china that my grandmother had. For decades, I thought it was yellow because my family was poor. I figured it was just low quality, but when I got it, I washed it all 5 times. The entire set is white. It was yellow due to all of the tar deposits from my grandmother's smoking, and it was packed into the back of the cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. That's how much a lot of older people smoked. I got married right around the time my grandfather sold his 1,200 square foot house and moved in with my parents. He was getting rid of the 30-year-old bedroom set that he and my grandmother had slept on. 30 years of constant exposure to their 2 to 3 packs a day each habit. I said I'd take it to put in our second bedroom. Friends helped me move it in, and all of our hands were stained yellow from the smoke residue that covered every part of the set. It took my wife and I a week of cleaning it to get the worst of it off. Even though the old times are thought to be very smoker friendly, I think a lot of the newer generations tend to underestimate how severe the problem was. Story 12. The 80s was not colorful. It was brown and burnt orange as far as the eye could see. Early 90s were a colorful time. Goths today have no idea how easy they have it. We had to raid our grandma's closet, go to thrift stores and learn to sew and alter. LOL. I also don't think people know just how important safety pins are as an accessory. We had at least 5 in every pair of pants. We also pierced ourselves with them. Early mid-90s, I never knew there were piercing shops. At 40, I still have my nose piercing I did with a safety pin in the 8th grade. In junior high, I colored my fingernails black with a Sharpie because black nail polish was not really a thing you could buy. Colored hair dye? Nope. We had Kool-Aid. Aging punk rocker here, we used to have to sew our jeans into skinny jeans and cut our own hair because there was no salon that would even come close to understanding or being willing to attempt to create the haircuts we wanted. And yep, we had to wait until Halloween for black nail polish, and even then it was shitty costume makeup quality. And if you wanted a certain band shirt or a cool band patch or something, you screen printed your own. It really was an awesome time. The creativity and ingenuity you had to show to look how you wanted was really fun. Fortunately, the DIY bit is still strong in the punk scene. Have 3 blank shirts I intend to paint making my own patches. Every crust punk I know is still at that, along with most hardcore punks. The only DIY thing that's really died out is probably people sewing the grommets from old Converses onto pants, but that was lost in the early 2Ks. Still have friends making their own small distros so they can make everyone screen printed shirts and patches. Punk culture is pretty timeless, all other things considered. Story 13. That feminism isn't some moldy concept from the distant past. In the US, sexual discrimination in education wasn't outlawed until 1972, which just happened to be the same year unmarried women were legally allowed to access birth control. Additionally, prior to 1974, women were not allowed to have credit cards or loans in their own names. They were simply authorized users of their husband's credit cards. Some employers also required married women to have their husband's permission before they were offered employment. When people talk about how women in the 1950s and 1960s stayed married, even when the marriage was clearly rocky, it was less about devotion and more to do with the lack of equal access to education, work, and finances. The divorce rate skyrocketed in the 70s, but not because women were suddenly wanton and looking for a good time. It was because they were no longer forced to remain in a bad marriage as a matter of financial survival. Everyone my age had a story to tell of their mothers in the 60s being told, "Come back with your husband," when they wanted to buy something expensive. My father still gets very angry when recounting how at the Big Ten university he worked at, they refused to let the women swimmers practice on campus after Title IX was created, thus allowing the creation of the women's swim team. For the record, Dad had nothing to do with the swim team or athletics. He just could not believe the sexism. I have a coworker who has worked for my department since the late 70s. She was telling me about how unfair the pay in the office was. She and a man started in the office around the same time, doing the same work, and he started out making 20% more than her, despite having very similar work history and skill sets. A year later, he got married and got a raise. She asked her boss about why she didn't get a raise when she got married, and was told she didn't have a wife at home she needed to support. A couple of years later, when he had a baby, he got another big raise. She was told she was lucky to still have her job at all after taking a few weeks off to recover from giving birth. Story 14. Landline telephones had seriously great audio quality, better than anything for remote conversation today in my opinion. I distinctly remember being a teenager and just talking on the phone with someone late into the night, hearing them breathe and sigh, hearing their every little sound. There wasn't the lag and the noise canceling and the high compression that ruins telephony today. It was a much purer way to feel like you were closer to someone than anything we have today. Speaking of sound quality, my wife and I have had satellite radio in our cars for what must be close to 20 years at this point. Maybe 3 months ago, we were driving through Columbus, Ohio. We live about an hour north of there now, and my wife started talking about a radio station we both loved back in the early 1990s. I switched the SXM radio over to FM and began searching to see if that station still existed. It did not, but we were both immediately struck by how much richer the FM station sounded through our car speakers. We assumed we were simply being nostalgic and nuts, but God help me, we began flipping back and forth between a classic rock station, QFM 96, Hallowed by Thy Name, and one of the SXM old school rock stations, and we were left with no doubt that terrestrial radio, if the signal is strong, sound much fuller and pleasing. It left me thinking about how in the name of convenience and wider selection we've settled for lesser and lesser. It's the difference between listening in your car to music through your phone, as opposed to listening to a physical compact disc. There's just no comparison. Honestly, it's shocking how poor the mic quality is on even high-end modern smartphones. We had so much better on landline phones as a rule. Story 15. They believe that you could support a family on minimum wage. I was working minimum wage in the early 1970s, and it was nowhere near enough to live on my own, much less have a house and a family. There is some misconception that the smiling family of a man, a woman, and 2 kids lived happily in a large home with everything they needed on a pittance of a factory worker's salary. Like there may have been a brief window of time following World War II, when the entire international community's production force had been decimated besides the US, that there was even a semblance of reality to this myth. Otherwise, remember that the US labor movement was created because of how bad conditions were, how little workers were paid, and how hard life was. Large families lived in packed tenement buildings with kids packed into small rooms. Children were pulled from school to work because the parents simply couldn't earn enough in the 100-hour work week they worked. My boomer dad grew up in a building where grandma lived upstairs and aunts and uncles lived downstairs. When his parents finally moved from the city to the suburbs for that single-family living, it was because both my grandfather and grandmother worked their asses off in factory jobs. My grandmother had this crazy notion that the day she stopped working would be the day she died. Not every family that had a home in the burbs was the mom stayed home and took meth to get it all done stereotype that kids now think it was. Exactly. While the minimum wage has gone down in real terms, it was never near enough. Story 16. The other day, I saw a comment on another thread where an older Redditor said they remembered X thing that was in the news back when they were around 4 years old, and some younger guy very authoritatively told them that you can't remember anything from before your preens except for a few core memories, unless you were directly involved in the events. This comment got a fair amount of upvotes from what I assume are younger people who don't realize previous generations like mine didn't grow up with smartphones, tablets, the internet, a million channels on TV, technology, etc. So yes, we actually were aware of a lot of the stuff that was happening in the world, including the major events in the news, regardless of whether we were old enough to understand what they meant, and we remember a ton of things from our actual lives. Why wouldn't we? I mean, we didn't have an avalanche of content to keep us distracted, no video games that lasted hundreds of hours, no TV or film on demand, just a handful of channels that went offline during the night, and didn't exactly broadcast interesting stuff all day, etc. Claiming everything before your preteens is mostly a fog of vague emotions, and you can only remember, say, the fall of the Berlin Wall or the explosion of the Challenger if you were directly involved, is a very weird take in my opinion, given how much I remember very clearly from my childhood, including a lot of the important news stories of the day. I don't know if the kid who said that is expressing a popular opinion among younger people that honestly reflects their experience, but I did find the claim really weird and also found it weird that it got several upvotes. So much this. I came here to say the same, but you said it better than I would have. I'm Gen X, and so shocked how little millennials and Gen Z know about history, or really anything that isn't right now. We had frickin' encyclopedias and the library, yet I knew a lot about my parents' and grandparents' generations. Now everything is at our fingertips, online, and yet they don't know shit about past generations. Since it's not a lack of access to information, I can only assume they aren't interested. I think young people might just be worse at remembering things, since they rely so much on technology to store those memories. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story to these that you would like to share with us, please leave it in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.